Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Matthew Shapiro, Director of the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research and a professor of economics. I'm so glad you can join us today for our ISR Insights Speaker Series. This series is a forum for ISR faculty to share their research to inform the public good. ISR has over 300 affiliated faculty who conduct research to address topics ranging from wealth inequality, aging and health, teen drug use, and politics and public opinion. As today's talk will exemplify, our work frequently combines primary data collection and research to understand both questions of economics and society and to inform public policy. You can find a full schedule of the talks on our website, isr.umich.edu, as well as recordings of the past talks, and we will post a recording of this afterwards. For today's talk, I'm just delighted to introduce our speaker, Joanne Hsu. Joanne is the director of the Surveys of Consumers that tracks leading economic indicators, including consumer sentiment and inflation expectations. Before coming to ISR, where she joined us earlier this year, she was a principal economist in the Division of Research and Statistics at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, where her portfolio included work on the Fed's survey of consumer finances, as well as working on their consumption forecast. Her research addresses a wide range of topics, too rich to summarize here, but in both economics and survey methodology. Needless to say, this is an interesting time to be running the University of Michigan's flagship survey on how households perceive the economy. Today, Joanne will discuss our consumer attitudes have evolved through the pandemic and the recent escalation in inflation and their potential implications for the economic outlook. It's just some housekeeping. We'll have a presentation of about 45 minutes and then Q&A at the end. So please enjoy the presentation. I'll turn things over to Joanne. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic okay? Fantastic. So I'm delighted to be here to be able to share some work with you today that's fairly timely. But before I get started, I wanted to shout out to my team. All the work that I'm going to be presenting today rests on the back of an incredible team, and including Mary, one of our students who's not on the list here, who've been working incredibly hard to get really timely data for us so we can understand what's going on in the economy. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'll begin with discussing why sentiment and expectations matter. I'll talk a little bit about how these attitudes have changed during the current post-pandemic, through the pandemic and recent inflationary era, and what those changes mean for consumers as well as our economy. So one of the things that that our survey produces is data for policymakers. And this June, the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, in a Q&A in a press conference mentioned how eye-catching the Michigan survey readings were, and mentioned our inflation expectations measures as one of the reasons for the rate hike that they did this summer, or the first of several rate hikes they did this summer. Our data are very closely followed also by media, and here are a selection of headlines that popped up over the summer. So our data is under a lot of scrutiny and is closely watched by people around the world. A little bit of background. Matthew called this one of the flagship surveys of the university, and indeed it was founded in 1946, so it's a very long-running survey and is one of the cornerstones of the Institute for Social Research, and was led by Richard Curtin between 1978 and 2022. And we have a monthly time series of consumer attitudes that can be compared over time that dates all the way back to 1978. And there really is no richer source of data on consumer attitudes toward the economy. It's designed to be nationally representative, and it's based on a monthly sample of about 600 consumers, and we give a preliminary reading mid-month as a sneak peek. And there's a core interview of 50 questions that have been very stable over the decades, but we also add timely questions depending to address current events and current developments in the world. In particular, the data we produce is used widely, not just in academic research, but also in forecasting in government agencies as well as the private sector. It helps companies and businesses plan their strategy And as mentioned before, it's really a critical input into economic policy. So what exactly are people looking for when they're watching the surveys of consumers? So overall, the main thing we're measuring is consumer sentiment. And in particular, we're trying to monitor how consumers' views, what their views are of current conditions as well as future expectations, not just for the macroeconomy, but also for their own financial situations. So it's sort of both macro and micro. And so the topics that we cover include business conditions in the economy, each individual's household personal finances and their income, what they think inflation is going to look like in the future, their experiences with labor markets, what they expect unemployment to look like in the year ahead. And we have a series of questions also about housing markets. Is it a good time to buy a house? Is it a good time to sell the house? Why is it? What do they think the Fed is going to be doing with interest rates going forward? And so on and so forth. So it's really a rich data set. But there is a common theme. These are all factors that we believe might be influencing consumers' economic behavior. And not just economic behavior today, but what they might be planning or decisions they might be making going forward. And this is precisely what is useful when we're trying to think about forecasting, planning public policy to shepherd the economy in the years ahead, and planning both in the public and the private sector. So why does consumer sentiment matter? So one component, as I mentioned, is inflation expectations. We ask consumers what they think inflation is going to look like in the year ahead, as well as 5 years ahead. The reason this matters is because expectations now can help us predict the future path of inflation. And because of that, it feeds into forecasts of the economy. Are we headed for a recession? Are we headed for continued economic growth? And obviously, these are going to be factors that are going to affect firm decisions also on where they're going to set their prices and where they're going to set wages. And of course, what's most interesting to me personally is to understand how it affects household decisions on spending, saving, whether or not to work, and so on and so forth. And in addition to inflation expectations, overall sentiment and expectations for the macroeconomy matter also. Again, your current sentiment over current conditions for the economy are going to inform expectations over your own financial situation going forward. What do you think your income might look like in the year ahead? That's going to depend on what you think labor markets will look like, whether or not your job is stable over the next year. And of course, this will then also affect, again, household decisions on spending, saving, labor, and other economic decisions. So the way things, how exactly does this feed into decision making? So let's dig a little bit deeper here. So consumption and savings choices. So choices to whether to buy things, when to buy things, what things to buy, depending on what your inflation expectations are, your expectations over the economy. If you think that inflation is going to go up in the future, you might want to buy things now or to stockpile to avoid higher prices in the future. If you think that the stock market is on its way up, you might want to invest in the stock market. Or if you think if it's going down, you might decide not to participate in the stock market. And so your expectations and sentiment over the economy is going to affect the types of spending decisions and savings decisions you make now and over your life cycle. Also critical are labor market decisions. What prices you expect for the future. If you expect inflation in the future, you might be seeking better job opportunities if they're out there that might give you higher wages to help you offset the pain of higher inflation. So that might manifest itself in negotiating for higher wages in your current job, or perhaps looking for another job to achieve higher wages. And that's something that's been in the news a lot, along with this idea of this great resignation and a shuffling of workers across jobs, which could be happening because people expect the labor market to be strong or believe the labor market to be strong and believe that prices are going to increase in the future. Also, your outlook over the economy is going to affect whether you decide to get additional schooling or to pull out of the labor force to go to school. What we've seen in past recessions is that when we see unemployment, a lot of those who become unemployed go back for more training or go back for more schooling to help them have better labor market prospects in the midst of the recession. And so your expectation for how long is a recession going to last, or how long is an economic boom going to last, will affect those decisions. And similar to the decision of schooling versus work, there's also the retirement decision. And we saw a wave of retirements during the COVID pandemic and the COVID recession, which is separate, partially, related to health, but also, whether or not you want to keep working is going to depend on your expectations for how your wealth is going to evolve and how the economy is going to evolve. And housing decisions are also really critical, right? We ask a lot of questions on our survey about whether people think it's a good time to buy a home or to sell a home. And timing those transactions is going to depend on if you think prices are rising, house prices are rising or falling, where you think interest rates are going, whether you or not you'd be able to refinance. And if prices are too high or interest rates are too high, you may decide to rent instead. And so these are decisions that are going to depend not just on what's going on now, but these are lasting decisions that are going to depend on what you are thinking about in the future. So I've talked about all this data that we collect. Do consumers actually know what they're talking about, and do they have expectations that even make sense? The really neat thing is that over time, we have found that consumer sentiment is a leading indicator for economic growth. On this chart, I have a 4-quarter moving average of consumer sentiment from our survey in red, and GDP growth, real GDP growth in black. And as you can see, changes in consumer sentiment do a pretty good job of anticipating changes in economic growth. And what's in the news and what's on everyone's mind today is inflation. And as it turns out, expected inflation actually tracks changes in the consumer price index very closely as well. And we also ask consumers about where they think unemployment is going. If they think unemployment is going to rise in the year ahead or become lower in the year ahead. And again, expected unemployment anticipates very well changes in actual unemployment. So overall, on average, consumers do a pretty darn good job anticipating changes in the economy. But at the same time, attitudes differ quite a bit in the population. So historically speaking, younger consumers tend to report better sentiment than older consumers. And this is, I'm showing the last 10 years, but this is true pretty much from the beginning of the survey. We do see some convergence during the pandemic in 2020, but overall, younger consumers have stronger outlooks. Higher income consumers also tend to have more favorable sentiment than lower income consumers. But what's really interesting is that there's been a recent convergence just over the last year and a half or so. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Part of the reason is that inflation is hitting every part of the economy, but also in these very recent months, high income consumers are getting increasingly concerned about stock markets. And finally, one thing that our consumers want to talk about a lot on the survey, but is political factors. And we unfortunately only started surveying, asking consumers about this on a regular basis in 2017. But what you can see is that political polarization is really evident in our data. Under a Republican president, Republicans tend to have higher levels of sentiment than Democrats, with independents in the middle. And you can see that crossover right around the time that Biden became president. And currently under a Democratic administration, Democrats have higher levels of sentiment than Republicans, with, again, independents in the middle. At the end of the day, while we see these vast differences that are much larger in magnitude than we were seeing by income and age, on average, this isn't really affecting the overall index because the two extremes, the two parties more or less cancel each other out. And so it remains to be seen what's going to happen in the years ahead or the months ahead. So what does sentiment look like now. So here's a headline from June. U.S. consumer sentiment slumps record low on rapid inflation. And that's pointing to this low point right here, which was the lowest level of consumer sentiment that we ever recorded since the beginning of the survey. This can be really puzzling because I told you that consumers do a fairly good job anticipating changes in economic growth. But we have this record low level of sentiment, and consumer spending and the economy remains very, very strong. Spending is remaining really robust. So what is going on? Historically, there's been a fairly strong relationship between sentiment and unemployment. When unemployment is low, people tend to be happier and have a better outlook over the economy. But as you can see in this period after the onset of the pandemic, this link between sentiment and unemployment changed very dramatically. So here's a scatter plot of consumer sentiment and unemployment rates. And this is for all the data from 1952 through March 2020, when the US economy, when we basically shut things down from the coronavirus. So what you can see is in March, this purple diamond over here, consumer sentiment was very close to the historical trend line. So this month covers, I think, half before and half after the shutdown of the economy. In the early days of the pandemic, April, May, and June 2020, we have these blue dots over here. We have sentiment, we have unemployment spiking because of the economic closures. But sentiment still remained well above the trend line. And I think this makes sense because at that time, we didn't know how long these shutdowns were going to occur. We didn't know how long the pandemic was going to be. And consumers fully understood this was not a business cycle situation. So in spite of these off the charts unemployment that we've never seen before, sentiment still remained fairly high. However, fast forward to 2022, these red dots over here, we have sentiment declining, and now this year we have sentiment plummeting from 70 down to below 50, and those are the dots. That includes that historical low that we've never seen before. The reason for this, as you might imagine, is the effect of inflation. Inflation weighs heavily on consumers of all income groups. And if I showed this to you by education or age, you would see something very similar, where we have this huge spike in the share of people who are spontaneously telling us that higher prices is the primary reason that their personal finances have worsened. Zooming into the last 10 years, again, as I was showing you before in a previous graph, that higher income folks tend to have better levels of sentiment than lower income folks. And indeed, in general, higher income folks tend to have fewer complaints about high prices than lower income families. But still, in this environment over the last year, we see this convergence in families, high or low income, telling us that inflation is really taking a bite out of their living standards. So if we plot consumer sentiment and inflation on a scatter plot, again, March 2020 is right on the historical trend line. Nothing odd about that. In April 2020 and the remaining months of April, we're still in a low inflation environment, but the economy has, the world has shut down in this new pandemic reality. And so it makes sense that in spite of this amazing low inflation environment, people are still feeling really dismal and for those to be below trend. And then we have 2022 and all of these, and now we're in a high inflation environment, not so many dots in the past, not as many historical examples of this high inflation, but even compared to even higher inflation periods in the late 70s, consumer sentiment is extremely low. One of the reasons for this, that sentiment is so low, even related to compared to time periods with even higher inflation, is the vast number of sources of uncertainty in the environment today. And as a result of this uncertainty, there's a lot of information that consumers don't have that would not have been an issue during in earlier periods. So COVID, of course, is number one. I'm not sure what things would look like if we measured consumer sentiment with the Spanish flu in 1917, but we're absolutely, as we all know, in an unprecedented situation where so many people died, and at the same time, there are also people who are feeling very uncomfortable and unhappy about policy responses to COVID. And then we have direct factors that are related to inflation. Supply constraints. Consumers have been have told us actually about all of these factors that are here spontaneously on our survey. So with supply constraints that are different, occurring differently in different industries, with different problems for microchips being a little bit different than lumber, but supply constraints across the board, and no one really knows when those are going to resolve. And then the uncertainty over energy prices. That energy prices have come down quite a bit since their peak earlier this summer, but with the ongoing war in Ukraine and the possibility of a long winter in Europe and the increasing fuel prices abroad, consumers are fully aware that energy prices could turn very quickly. And then, of course, there's the risk of recession. There's so much news and so much talk about, are we in a recession? Are we going to be in a recession? And these are things that are really heightening the emotions of American consumers. And then finally, we have political factors. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but political factors are increasingly being spontaneously mentioned by our consumers. We ask a question at the end of the survey, is there anything else you want to tell us? Is there something you wish we had asked about? And a lot of people are mentioning politics and are drawing connections between politics and their economic outlook in ways that are just beyond fiscal policies that are different across candidates. People are expressing quite a bit of uncertainty and anxiety about the election. People are mentioning abortion access. People are mentioning the border and immigration. And then there's some folks who are mentioning student loan forgiveness as well, among other types of policies. And we are seeing consumers expressing displeasure on all sides and feeling uncertain on all sides of these policies. So having all of these negative factors and all this uncertainty that consumers have to sit with is going to heighten their emotions and potentially heighten their anxiety, which adds noise to the information that they are that might otherwise be the primary factors to affect their expectations and sentiment. And beyond that, we are in an environment of negative news, and what this chart shows here are what consumers are telling us about the news that they've heard about recent changes in business conditions. Higher up on the axis is more favorable news, hearing more favorable news. Lower on the vertical axis is more negative news. And what you can see is that we are right here. And in spite of the fact that the labor market is strong, and in spite of continued economic growth, we have consumers telling us that they're hearing news that rivals recessions. Even when we compare to the inflationary environment in the 70s, with the exception of this recession in 1974, they're hearing more bad news about the economy now than during any of those points in those periods. And so this is absolutely adding to negative sentiment. I don't want to call this causal, because it could be that consumers with already negative sentiment are seeking news sources that confirm their thoughts. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because if they're doing that, it's still reinforcing their negative sentiment. And so this is, I think, something that we don't talk about enough, that just how different this current news environment is to previous inflationary periods. So of course, people are feeling so dismal about the economy, right? So what are the implications of these changes? So I haven't actually yet talked about inflation expectations when I started this talk talking about how policymakers care so much about it. So here we have a plot of expected change in prices in the short run on the left-hand side and on the long run in the right-hand side. And what you see for both is that they are elevated right now, which makes a lot of sense. However, these expectations are quite modest compared to the 1970s. I will say that I think the right comparison for us right now for 2022 is not what I've shown here, which is the late 70s, like 78, 79. We're probably more comparable to a situation in the early 70s where we don't have all of the inflation expectations data, because by the time we're over here, consumers had already seen almost a decade of elevated inflation, and we've only been seeing it for a year or so. So again, it's higher than it's been previous to the pandemic, but relatively modest. So people are not expecting this inflation to persist on average at the median. However, just as I was saying before, there's so much uncertainty about this. There is no consensus among consumers on the future path of inflation. What I have here is a measure of inflation uncertainty using the interquartile range. And the black line is for short run inflation expectations, and the red dots are for long run inflation expectations. And so looking at the black one, I mean, it peaked earlier in the summer, but even now it is so high. We've not seen inflation expectations uncertainty this high since the end of the 70s. And with the year ahead, or with the long run inflation expectations, the last time we saw uncertainty this high was in the late 80s, in the recession at that time. So we're in a situation where everyone knows that prices are really high right now, but there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of uncertainty about what it will look like. So I will say this isn't because consumers don't think the Fed is going to act. There is a question on the survey on, do you think interest rates are going to rise over the next year? And everyone says yes. Almost 90% of people expect interest rates to rise in the year ahead, even after all the interest rate hikes we've already seen this year. We don't ask if they think those hikes will work, but they're certainly expecting a policy action. So that's not the reason for the uncertainty. So in spite of all this inflation uncertainty, and in spite of the fact that sentiment is so low, why is consumer spending still robust? I think the main reason for this is the strong labor market. And not just a strong labor market, but people have pretty strong expectations over their own personal income. So this is, what is the expected change in my own household income, not the labor market, not the economy as a whole. And so the majority of consumers do expect their incomes to rise over the next year, but they're not expecting it to rise very much. On average, less than 2%. So, 2% gain is better than zero, is better than negative, but it's not a whole lot, and it doesn't keep pace with inflation. So why, I mentioned before, inflation expectations and sentiment matter because it passes through to consumer behavior, and those changes in consumer behavior can aggregate into changes in the economy. So in this inflationary environment, there are, a few factors that are at play here. So if you expect inflation to be higher in the future and you negotiate higher wages, or you switch jobs to a higher wage jobs, having more income can, of course, cushion the pain of inflation on your household budgets. And it's going to make individual households feel better, but it puts the economy at some risk of what economists call a wage price spiral. And what this means is that if firms are seeing their wages or are setting their wages higher and higher, then they might set their prices for the goods or services they sell at an even higher level. And so in this kind of situation, there is a danger that inflation expectations could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another way that could happen is inflationary psychology, and in particular, buying this idea that you should buy in advance. So if you should buy something now, buy that refrigerator right now before it gets more expensive 6 months from now or next year. Doing that might be good for your own house. It might make sense for your own home to try to avoid future price increases. But if lots of households are doing this, it's going to increase demand for these goods, which will further put upward pressure on price pressures on the prices of those goods. And again, could turn inflation into a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
However, it's not all news in that sense. Consumers can also respond to inflation by scaling back their spending. And this is what the Fed is hoping for. So if consumers scale back their spending because their budgets just can't handle it, or because they're trying to save more money now to weather, and because they think there might be a recession coming up, or if they think they might be, their incomes might go down in the future, you might want to cut back now in order to increase your savings. And so that would be a way to reduce demand and would put downward pressure on inflation. The problem is if everyone scales back too much, it could exacerbate the risk of recession, particularly if firms are going to lay off people because their sales aren't as strong, or for reasons like that. So it is kind of a nice edge, and this is what people are talking about when they're asking the Fed, can they engineer a soft landing? Can demand be scaled back enough without driving into a recession? So in terms of, is inflation becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy? The first factor that I mentioned was, the impact on wages. And again, this is the chart I just showed you before on expected change in household income. People are expecting income changes of 2%, nowhere near the 5, 6, 7, 8% changes in inflation that we're seeing. So that does not seem to be a problem for the moment. Of course, our survey doesn't really show what firms are doing on their side. Now, our expectations passing through to behavior in terms of, are people trying to buy in advance to avoid future price increases? So we asked this question related to durable goods, large durable goods like appliances, cars, and houses. And what I'm showing here is durable goods. And so in the blue line, we have the share of people who say it's a good idea to buy durable goods now in order to avoid future price increases. And many people are financing their purchases of durable goods. So we also ask people, is it a good time to buy because interest rates are low, or you expect interest rates to get higher in the future? And you can see that for both of these things, well, there's not much variation in borrowing in advance. But for buying in advance, in the late 70s, or even in the early 70s, a lot of people thought it was a good idea to preemptively buy things. But we're not actually seeing that here. What a lot of consumers tell us is, well, you should buy it if you need it. If your fridge breaks down, you have no choice. But very few consumers believe it's a good idea to buy now, even though they expect inflation in the future. So I will point out again that we're only 1 year into an inflationary environment. And in the 1970s inflation episodes, it took actually several years of sustained inflation for this inflationary psychology to set in. So finally, I discussed how this can pass through to consumption, right? It could be that, when if people are expecting bad times ahead and the inflation is really taking a big bite at your budget, that you really try hard to cut back your spending. What we're seeing is that in spite of, elevated inflation expectations, in spite of low sentiment, consumption remains very robust. So what this chart here is personal consumption expenditures, and a percent change from a year ago. And here we are right here. I think this is data from September, and it's historically quite strong. We're down from this peak here that was, because we had a small denominator from the pandemic. And it is true that part of the strong spending we're seeing right now is a bit of pent up demand, people doing traveling that they weren't doing during the peak of the pandemic, which is unlikely to endure. But we're seeing, growth in consumption in a lot of different categories. We're seeing preliminary evidence in our survey that low and middle income consumers are starting to cut back or have been cutting back. And actually now we're seeing, as I mentioned before, we're now seeing higher income consumers getting the double whammy, where they're concerned about high prices just like everybody else, but also they're getting their wealth hit by turbulence in the stock market. We've seen strong things so far, but a lot of uncertainty for what's to come. So to sum up, despite strong labor markets and despite the fact that many aspects of the economy are running really strongly, consumer sentiment remains near historic lows, and consumers broadly expect a recession to come. They're more or less expecting the other shoe, just waiting for this other shoe to drop. And part of the reason they feel so dismal about the economy, of course, is high inflation. And inflation has hit really all parts of the population. And the thing is that in a previous environment, previous periods of high inflation, people really did not feel as dismal as they do now. But we are in an unprecedented environment coming out of a pandemic with political polarization we haven't seen in prior periods, and the proliferation of bad news. So consumers are just being really surrounded by sources of uncertainty, and that they're constantly being reminded about with this proliferation of bad news. So again, consumer attitudes are being weighed down by this uncertainty, and are being weighed down by the negative emotions around these peripheral factors that economists may not traditionally think of as directly impacting sentiment. So what I think this means for the economy is that consumer spending, and while consumer spending and the economy remain robust, we're probably in for a bumpy road ahead. I showed you how in June we reached an all-time low in consumer sentiment. Things improved a little bit in September or in August, and since then there have been very small increases that are not precisely measured. And so the news has run off with this every time they see a 1 point increase in the consumer sentiment index. Consumer sentiment improved for the third straight month. But frankly, while we saw an improvement from the all-time low, we're still very, very close to the all-time low. And I think all of these improvements are tentative. So it'll be really interesting to keep monitoring this in the months ahead. If you're interested in accessing the survey data yourself, here is our website. And the most up-to-date headline data are posted here approximately every other Friday at 10 a.m. There's a link to our data archive as well as analytical tools. And there's our inbox if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
So thanks for a great presentation. Very, very fascinating times to be an economist. We will have some question and answer that Joanne will moderate, but I'm going to take chair's privilege by asking the first question. So you showed us interesting findings that that sentiment is as low, roughly as low as it was during the stagflationary period of the 70s, when inflation was high, but you also had unemployment high. And the puzzle now is that the aggregate economy job outlook looks very strong, almost historical lows in the unemployment rate. Is there any evidence in the survey that consumers are worried about losing their jobs, despite the fact that the aggregate labor market seems very strong?
Not really. So we do have questions on the probability of losing your own job, and that remains low. And so basically we have that question. We have questions on income expectations. We have the income expectations on your own income. And every single question on personal income or labor market outcomes are all positive. Now, they're more positive for young people. Young people seem to have the most optimism over their incomes as well as their labor market prospects, which I think bears out in their ability to find new jobs in this environment. But yes, what we're seeing is not explained by, I think I'm worse off than the overall labor market.
Other questions?
Yeah, you had your inflation expectations back in the 80s, that high period, and then in more recent, it seemed like it was attenuated compared to that period. I was just looking at the NFIB data, where they asked the firms, you plan to raise prices, and that was really high last fall, and looked just like the 1980s. So this is kind of different expectations. What do you expect to do? I've got my plans, I got to raise prices. I wonder if you use both the consumer and the NFIB expectation data, whether that would somehow give you a better way to understand the risks of inflation.
I mean, I think that is a fantastic idea, because, you know, as I was discussing earlier, it's not just consumer buying behavior. Firms have to make a decision too. And so firms can react to the higher input prices, including higher wages, by eating those costs or by passing them on to consumers. So I think the combination of the two could be very powerful. Absolutely.
The reason I was looking at it because there's the dialogue on, gee, it's only transitory inflation. And I thought, boy, it sure looks like 1980, at least from the NFIB survey.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I had a question. I thought it was really interesting how people seem to be differently, including other types of sentiment or other political sentiment. But I wanted to know if you felt that there was other changes in sentiment beyond kind of the politics and news cycle, like whether you've seen data or have a sense of whether people are more personally unsatisfied with their lives, or like questions about depression and anxiety that are tracking that have seen a structural break in the last 2 years, or whether it's really something specific about politics and news.
So I think you raise a really important point. You know, to what extent is economic sentiment unique, or are people just unhappy overall? And that's not something I've looked into, and I think that's a really good idea. You know, the data are out there. And I think that's separate from the question is this just politics and news? I don't think it's just politics and news. I mean, I think we cannot overstate the effect of, you know, the world-changing, life-changing, attitude-changing effect of the pandemic. And also these things are also related, right? You know, how you feel about public health measures is related to your political affiliation. And so, you know, I think we're just in an unprecedented, I'm calling it a trifecta. I think it's probably more than a trifecta of issues that we haven't seen before. But I think it would be really interesting to take a look at what life satisfaction looks like outside the economic sphere.
You talk about the news effect, and as a recovering journalist, so what are the, you say it may or may not be causative. If you were talking about what is the good news out there that could be reported, and do you think if there were more reporting of the underlying good news about unemployment and whatnot, that it would have any effect at all?
So we do ask people not just, you know, are you hearing favorable news or unfavorable news? We also ask, we also follow up to ask, you know, what are you hearing? And a lot of our consumers do tell us multiple things. They're not only telling us negative things, and they're not always telling us positive things. One of the kind of tricky things about you know, news about business conditions is that the strong labor market can still be perceived as negative news with respect to business conditions. So when we hear about firms, we can't hire, we can't find workers, you know, that's great for workers, but it's but consumers still hear that and internalize that as like, I can't, you know, my favorite coffee shop just does not have anyone to staff it. You know, I can't find a contractor, or, you know, whatever the case may be. So we're in this kind of strange situation that like even good news can be perceived as bad news as well. But in terms of, you know, good news that we might be hearing about here, you know, falling gas prices, you know, developments in fiscal policy to you know, like the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, some people are going to call that positive news, some others will call it negative news. So there are a lot of things that can be interpreted in both ways depending on who the consumer is.
I have one. I'm pretty loud. Oh. I was just going to say, are you allowed to tell us your opinion? Should we be scared?
You can ask and I can decide.
What amazes me, and I know 600 people were interviewed, but in the past I know it was 500. It was, and for everybody here and for myself, it'd be interesting to know how you can derive so much information from just interviewing so few people.
You know, we're interviewing, you know, to me, 600 people a month is an enormous number of people. And so I think we do need to be careful when, you know, doing cuts by demographic groups. And what we often do in that situation is to look at things on a 3-month moving average to get out of the problem of the small sample size. What we've seen is that 600 people is, on a monthly basis, what they tell us is incredibly powerful. So I am very thankful. If there are any viewers out there who have served as respondents on this survey, we are extremely grateful for your participation, and also really grateful to the folks at the survey research operations team who are on the phones for us and calling people over and over to make sure we get their voice.
Thank you for your presentation. That was wonderful. So my question is, do you ask, like, as far as employment goes? So I know you made a comment earlier about like younger folks seem to be more secure or satisfied than older. And I wondered, the spike in employment and does that have anything to do with the non-traditional jobs that maybe the younger generation are going into, and would that increase their satisfaction or their security in their jobs?
Are you thinking of like gig economy jobs, or are you thinking of something else?
Yeah.
So I think gig economy jobs can can influence our data in a couple of different ways. So it could increase the number of opportunities that are available to people, particularly young people who are willing to do it. But at the same time, gig economy jobs are fairly unstable, right? Like a lot of these jobs, the demand for it shrank a lot, like Uber and transportation during the pandemic. And there's still, a lot of fluctuations out there, and probably differences by geography on how much demand there is. And some of these jobs, gig economy jobs, are also hard work, right? And so Joelle has done a lot of work on the gig economy. I can probably speak more to that. But I think like the uncertainty and the lack of sort of consistent income could weigh down people's feelings about that. But having more options could also make them feel better. So I think it could go either way.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question about the changes in consumer spending pattern. Just comparing life currently to life at the beginning of the survey, folks are spending probably more on services than goods originally, and especially after the pandemic, when society is starting to open up and people are traveling and that kind of stuff. I wondered if you factored that into your presentation, and maybe I missed that part, or how would spending for services rather than traditional durable goods and so forth affect some of the results that you've found?
That's a great question. Composition of spending has absolutely changed over time, and even within a single business cycle. So actually measuring services is something that's very challenging, like services spending. So we don't actually measure it directly right now. And the types of spending we do measure, or attitudes towards spending with durables, cars, and houses, are highly correlated with overall spending, but we don't really have a breakdown for services. If you have ideas on that, we are, that's something that we've been wrestling with for sure.
And there's just been very recent reports of layoffs and drops in employment in the technology sector, which is of course the biggest one. And so I'm wondering whether you have any data at this point in time that speaks to that, or what your sort of expectations might be as to how that would factor in, perhaps, raising unemployment and raising inflation.
So my impression is that the average consumer is not necessarily super in tune with sector specific layoffs, especially since they just started to increase. So I think I would expect it to start showing up in our data probably next month or the month after. I think it's too soon see the recent kind of state of chaos in the tech sector.
Hi, thanks very much. Interesting. It is pretty much interesting that we observe the political preference reflects, no, the sentiment reflects the political preference, and it's quite understandable as well. So my question is, how much do their politically biased sentiment changes their actual behavior, or is it just superficial? So I just want to know that the degree of influence of political preference or party bias sentiment.
I think that's really an excellent question, and I think we don't have good answers about that yet. Part of the reason is that that overall, I think researchers haven't been, or economic researchers haven't been paying as close attention to the political polarization until relatively recently. Like our survey would do a one-time measurement during each administration, but we weren't tracking it, throughout an administration. And so, like, we know the polarization has been going on for some time, probably going back to the Obama years. And I'm not, I would expect that, if your political party is in power and your sentiment is higher, then that it's going to positively impact your willingness to spend. But I don't think that there's good data on the actual spending by political affiliation. I will say I do think that political affiliation is an outcome, not it's and it very well could be influenced, like whether you're independent or Democrat or independent or Republican can be influenced by the economy as well. And so I don't really think of it as a static category like educational attainment or marital status. I guess those things can change also. But I think of it as an outcome akin to sentiment.
Well, so thanks very much for a great and informative presentation. Thank you all for coming, and please come to our future ISR Insights speaker events. Thanks.